Hello and welcome to Writing with Steve, with me, Steve Evans. This video is the first in a series of analysing texts. So I'm going to take you through some textual analysis for two reasons. The first reason is, as writers, we need to read and we need to analyse what we read with our writers' heads on. So of course the more we read and the more tools we have for analysis, the stronger we become as writers, but also the easier it becomes to analyse a text. And by text I mean any written piece of work, whether it's poetry or prose. So that's one reason. The second reason is for schoolwork. If you're studying at the moment, analysis is something that you're going to be asked to do, and it's something you're graded on. So I want to take you through some techniques and some tips regarding analysis, which I hope you'll find really useful, particularly those who are studying at this moment. So in a few moments we're going to be analysing the poem Brooklyn Cop by the Scottish poet Norman MacCaig. Okay, so there are lots of exam boards out there, but generally they're asking for the same things. First thing is, they want you to engage with the text that you're studying or analysing. Secondly, they want a genuine and authentic response to the text. So what I mean by that is that they would like your own comments rather than stock comments. So it's really your personal take on the text. So the more that you are able to demonstrate your personal response to the text, the more sophisticated answer you are able to give and demonstrate to the examiner. Now, some of you are familiar from school and college with the P formula or the P's formula, which is point, evidence and explain, or point, evidence and explanations. Explanations meaning that there are a number of possible explanations to the reading of the text, a number of different ways of reading the text, which is fantastic. You know, that's a really good idea, to acknowledge that this line could mean, or possibly, or maybe. So I would also say that when you're responding to a text, always use those kind of hedging words like possibly, maybe, perhaps, because what you're demonstrating to the examiner is that you're aware that a text operates on a number of levels and that there are many readings of that text. So there's not always one response, particularly as the writer, particularly a poet, is using show not tell and leaving it up to the reader to create their own explanations. So I would always use that kind of what we call the subjunctive, perhaps. You know, we'll always use that type of framing for your response. So with that, I've said personal response, your own reading of it, the use of perhaps and maybe. The next step is to think of your response. Now people will say, well, every response is fine providing that you can support it with evidence from the text, and that's bang on. That's really good advice. So I would always say there's a difference between a fanciful response, a fanciful explanation to a text, and something that is well informed. So what I mean by well informed is that it is supported by evidence from the text, and again that's what the examiner is expecting. You may also hear me using the word speaker and poet. That's because the speaker and the poet can be two different people. If the poem is highly autobiographical, the speaker and the poet we know are the same person. But it also pays to use the word speaker in many poems, because the poet may be creating a persona and may be creating another character in which to deliver and communicate his or her message. So if you're familiar with the poem Hitcher by Simon Armitage creates the persona of a serial killer. So Simon Armitage isn't a serial killer, I hope. Don't sue me, Simon. But we do know that he's using that character to look within the mind of such a person and to chart and explore their thought processes. So it's handy to differentiate between the speaker and the poet. So just listen out for that when I'm analysing the poem. Before we do, I just wanted to mention that this is the first time I'd read it, so I came really cold into the poem. I didn't know anything about it or where it was leading me to, which is brilliant because it's enabled me now to have these meta moments with you where I can model my approach to it and what I was doing and what I was thinking as I was reading through each line. Also, this analysis is not exhaustive in the sense that I'm using all of the tools of analysis, which means that if you want to see some more analytical tools being used, please watch the further videos that we're going to be making looking at poems and other texts from the curriculum. The first thing that strikes me with Brooklyn Cop is its title. Looking at the title and considering it is always a good place to start because it may give clues, it may indicate the subject matter of the poem. And yes, it does. It already gives me an explanation about what this is going to be about. It's going to be about a Brooklyn cop. And that also lends me to think, if I didn't know, well, where's Brooklyn and what is Brooklyn? So if you didn't know, that's something that we could research. So that's something again that you need to bring into a poem, that you can read the poem, you'll interpret it, but it also is really useful if you can do some research around it too. And I always say, if it mentions a geographic area, find out what that geographic area is. Also, it pays to look at the poets, find out a little about the poet, their lives, and it also pays to have a look at some more examples of what the poet has written to see if you can find connections with similar themes that he or she have written about. I'd also look at other poems that this poet has written so I can search for similar themes. Is this a theme? Is this an idea that the poet returns to a number of times? So it always pays to do this type of research. If you're unfamiliar, Brooklyn is a borough of New York. It's a district of New York. So we know that the poem's going to be set in the United States of America. Built like a gorilla, but less timid. Thick flesh, steak-coloured. So the poet starts by presenting a physical description of this cop. And to me, it looks like the speaker's response to seeing a New York cop for the first time and his reaction to what he sees. Perhaps he is comparing the cop to the police back home. So the poet's using a simile. He compares him to a gorilla, like a gorilla. So that's a really interesting comparison, but less timid, because we all know that gorillas are far from timid. So does the poet mean that the cop is tougher and more fierce than a gorilla? If so, the poet is using understatement and he's using humour to drive home his point. And also then, what does the word gorilla suggest to you? To me, it suggests something that can be fierce, strong, almost primitive force as well. You know, when we unpack that word, gorilla, there are lots of inferences, lots of connotations from that one word alone. And another connotation is that a gorilla is rather hunched over and thick set. And the second line, thick fleshed, steak coloured, kind of supports that, doesn't it? The idea of thick fleshed to me means strong muscled, very thick, maybe thick skinned as well, particularly if he gets criticised and he gets name called and abuse from the people in the streets where he's patrolling. So thick flesh could almost mean thick skinned as well. Steak coloured is that idea again, isn't it, of the body and strength. Also steak that might be pale, or it could be very strong if it's overdone, couldn't it? So it could also imply that his face is weather beaten. It's made red and ruddy by the weather and the wind and the rain. That's my reading of it. That's what's suggested. That's how I'm engaging with those words, with that description. And of course, it's up to you to engage with your own reading of those words. Hieroglyphs in his face that mean trouble. Wow, that's a graphic description. What a metaphor. Hieroglyphs in his face. And you think, wow, what can that mean? So of course you start thinking, well, hieroglyphs. What are hieroglyphs? So hieroglyphs are symbols. They're graphic representations for meanings, for words, but they're really difficult to understand, aren't they? They're really difficult to read. So my take on that is to say that the cop's face is really difficult to read. What's he thinking behind his eyes? The hieroglyphs I've already taken to be his eyes. Now, it doesn't state explicitly that the hieroglyphs are his eyes, but that's my take on it. That's my reading of it. So it presents somebody who is inscrutable. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't know what they're going to do next. And maybe that's why the poet uses the word trouble. What's other connotations? So when I use connotations, you've heard me use that quite a lot now. It just means what else is suggested by a word or a phrase or the poem. So the word hieroglyphics now, I'm picturing the writing that's been chiselled on the temple walls or a temple pillar in ancient Egypt and have become rather worn by the weather. So again, perhaps it's a reference to his weather-beaten face, that there's lots of wrinkles have been etched or chiselled like hieroglyphics all over the man's face. So he poses in this first stanza an imposing figure. He seems to be very stocky, he seems to be very dangerous, and he also seems to be very experienced because his face is weather-worn by all the years spent on the beat. So I hope you're seeing that I'm looking for clues. So see it as a game. See unpacking any text as a game that you can play, that you're a detective in a story and you're looking for clues to explain the poem's meaning, or what the poem's meaning means to you. The speaker then highlights how dangerous the cop's job is. He can't be guaranteed to return home to his wife. And the gorilla analogy comes in handy again. The phrase, "it's a jungle out there," springs to mind. And then we have this intriguing thin tissue over violence. Now that makes me think that in the cop's daily life, violence is never far away and liable to erupt at any time. The cop is playing his part, preventing violence. But the poet's also stating that to prevent violence, he's also had to use force and violence too. So let's look at this metaphor, the thin tissue over violence. Now, it's really good to be able to pinpoint the technique that the poet's using, for example, figurative language like similes and metaphors, etc. But what's really more important as a writer, and I guess as a student who's looking for the highest grades, is to be able to explain why that technique is being used. To what purpose is the writer using it? So the metaphor, the thin tissue over violence, makes me think that in the cop's daily life, violence is never far away and liable to erupt at any time. And thin tissue also contrasts with the thick flesh of the cop. He needs to be strong to patrol this tough neighbourhood where violence can erupt at any moment. And I'm also looking, as I'm going through, at other words that are linking and associated with violence. So we have the use of the word plunge and tear, which again suggests that violence is about to erupt at any moment, and it's only this thin surface of civilization that the cop is stepping on. That sidewalk is almost a thin tissue of civilization, and at times he's the only thing, the only person who is stopping chaos and anarchy from erupting in the streets. You may be familiar with the term semantic field, so they are words that are associated that we can group together. And I'm noticing as I'm reading through the poem that we do have words associated with violence and weapons. The poet uses clubbings, gunshot and nightstick. And I think MacCaig is using those words to emphasise the danger that the cop faces daily in his patrol of the sidewalks. And I was really taken when it mentions his patch. His patch is between Phoebe's Whamburger and Louis' place. And this attention to detail, it just paints a picture of a typical New York street. I also think it means that perhaps this stretch that he patrols is a little downbeat. It's not full of refined restaurants. These are diners, and these are very, very cheap eateries. I was also taken and engaged with the word Whamburger, Phoebe's Whamburger, because A, it's a piece of onomatopoeia, wham, but also again it really fits the theme of this cop and his dangerous patrol, because wham, of course, is associated with hitting and punching, but it also reminds me of graphic novels and Batman, where you used to have wham and blam. So perhaps is this suggesting that the cop is seen as a type of superhero who again is going to engage in violence to save the lives of innocent citizens? And again, within that short distance of these eateries, violence can erupt at any time. Again, that's really intriguing, and he's building up a picture, isn't he, of the cop, why he has to be tough, and his patch that he has to patrol. And looking again at the detail that the poet provides, we're told that he's married and he hopes every time he does his beat that he comes home safely. And I think by giving these details, it's making the reader sympathetic to him, that he may never get back to his babe and his honey. And I find the poet's use of honey and babe intriguing, because some people might see those as un-PC or patronising even, but an alternative reading can suggest that this cop has old-fashioned values, and after all, honey and babe are terms of endearment. So always handy to have an alternative explanation and to mention both meanings in your response. The third stanza signals a more reflective mood. The speaker asks us to place ourselves in the cop's position. Is it a job we would want to do? Is it a job he enjoys doing? And he emphasises this by offering a string of rhetorical questions. Who would be him? He might never get back to. And I think the use of these rhetorical questions are forcing the reader to place themselves in that position. As we know, rhetorical questions do not need an answer, but what they're doing is placing an idea and a thought in the reader's or the listener's head. So it's asking us to ask that. Who would be a cop patrolling that type of neighbourhood? Who would want to worry daily that he may not ever return to his family and loved ones? And the fourth stanza then turns the perspective from the cop to one of his victims, and it uses a rhetorical question again. And who would want to be one of his victims? Who would want to be on the receiving end of this fierce, tough, strong cop? And I think the word victim is really, really important. And this is the beauty of poetry. So MacCaig has deliberately chosen that word, and he's placed it in. There's a lot of thought in the use of that word, victim. What does that imply? He doesn't use the word criminal. He uses the word victim. So is he implying, is there the connotation there, is there the suggestion there that sometimes the cop gets it wrong? Does the cop beat up innocent people? So he's painting a very realistic picture of a cop, isn't he? He's saying that this man has to be superhuman. We want him to be superhuman, but at the same time we should acknowledge that he's frail and he's prone to make mistakes. So I've got my idea about what's going on in the poem from a first, second, even a third reading. Couple of points. I've been able to chart the course or the journey of the poem, and here structure is useful to comment on. So if you're giving a written response to an examiner, structure is useful. Now, just a tip: never write about what isn't in the poem. Always write about what you're finding in the poem. A, it's redundant to talk about what's not there. B, you are under time pressure usually, or a word count. So yeah, there's a structure here in this poem. There's a structure in every poem. What's important is to say what the structure is doing. This is no sonnet, we wouldn't have to mention that, it's no haiku, but what it is, it's a poem of 4 stanzas. The first stanza seems to be offering a description and placing the cop in his environment, what's happening. The third stanza becomes more philosophical and more reflective about the job the cop does and the role he plays in society generally. The fourth stanza carries on with this reflective tone, this mood about what it's like to be a cop, and also what's it like to be the victim of the cop. That's what the structure is doing. I also think there's a couple of other structural elements that might be worth mentioning. We have this bold statement at the beginning of the second stanza: he is a gorilla. Notice how we've moved from like a gorilla to he is a gorilla. Now, why is the poet choosing to bring in a transition from simile to metaphor? And I think this is because the word gorilla has so many associations, and I think in this part where we're moving to the danger that the cop faces, I think we should look at gorilla in terms of an endangered species. Like a gorilla, the cop faces many dangers, including death and extinction. And then this is followed by the poet mentioning about his wife, and he may never return to his wife and family. So again, placing a phrase alone, separate, he is a gorilla, is always used for emphasis. As part of my approach, I analyse the poem in two general stages. The first and the second run through of the poem is really to try and get into my head an understanding of what's going on and what it might be about in terms of what's actually happening in the poem. And I call that the denotation. So it's a word that you may be using in exams or when you're studying. So the denotation is what's the surface level, what's going on. And we know the surface level of this poem is a description of a cop who has a tough beat and the dangers he faces. The second stage is then to dig beneath the surface of the poem and examine whether there are any broader themes that the poem or the poet is addressing. And it's at this stage I might also bring in my knowledge about the poet from my research. What other themes does he write about? Is that a clue to what he's writing about here? Now, helping me with the connotation, looking beneath the surface, is a really neat analytical tool, and it's to look for opposites. You may also use the term binary opposites in your analysis at school or college. So I'm looking for binary opposites here. I'm looking for binaries. And I've noticed as I've gone through a number of them. So for example, I'm aware of the physical strength of the cop. I'm aware of his mental strength as he has to compose himself in readiness for this tough beat. But I also see the vulnerability, how much he misses his wife, how concerned he is that he may never return to her. The next opposite I'm seeing is duty to his job and to the citizens of New York, and the duty to his wife. And he's torn, he's facing danger, and he's making his wife worry constantly. We assume his wife is constantly on edge whether her husband's going to return. So we're seeing duty and loyalty to his city, to the badge, to the other cops, versus his duty and loyalty to his family, to his wife. Another intriguing and important opposite in this poem, and I think it's a major theme of this poem, is law and order versus chaos and anarchy. I think the poet's saying that civilization is only tissue thin, and the law and the people who are there to administer and patrol and to enforce the law are the only things that often stand in the way of anarchy. I also think, particularly in that fourth stanza where he mentions victims, that the poet is making the point that the law is far from perfect and that sometimes innocent people are punished and fall victim to it. But the law is better than nothing, and it's the only thing that stands between civilization and anarchy. And I think here, knowing a little bit about Norman MacCaig is useful. After the poem, I did a little research on the poet, and this is what I found. I found that during the Second World War, the poet refused to join up and fight. He was what we call a conscientious objector, and we usually associate this view as an opposition to violence. Now, that's really interesting, because I think the poet is acknowledging that there's no neat answer, that sometimes violence is necessary if it means upholding the law. So it really shows a contradiction, doesn't it, between Norman MacCaig's stance and view about the use of violence, his opposition to it, while he's torn and conflicted in the knowledge that sometimes violence is necessary to maintain civilization. And I think that demonstrates the power of literature, how it's able to present the contradictions of life and to emphasize that there are no neat solutions. I also noticed that the poem isn't using rhyme and it isn't following a regular rhythm. And you might say, so what? And again, it's always important to say why you think that's important and to say why do you think that's been done. To me, I think it makes it more gritty and realistic. I think it makes the description of the cop far more realistic and conversational, and the use of enjambment, remember the run-on lines, adds to this fluidity and mimics conversation that you have to read over to the next line to get a sense of what the poet, or the speaker rather, is saying. So for example, in stanza 4 we have, and who have to be his victims. And also in the second stanza we have the run-on lines, should the tissue tear, should he plunge through into violence. And in those lines, notice the repetition of the word should. The repetition of the words being used for emphasis because he's emphasizing a really important point. He's talking about how thin the surface is between civilization, law and order, and anarchy. And that can tear like a tissue at any time. The word plunge, to me, makes me consider thin ice. He's also saying that the surface is as thin as ice and liable to crack at any moment, and we plunge into chaos. So I hope that analysis of Brooklyn Cop was useful in demonstrating the different approaches you can take to analysing a text. This is going to be the first of many readings of texts, particularly those that are on the curricula for the school boards and colleges. If you're a student and you're watching, I wish you every success in your studies. If you're a parent or a grandparent, please share these videos with those you think would benefit from watching them. Before I go, I'd like to thank Claire Burns for providing me with a list of texts and poems that school boards in the UK are using. Until next time, from Carol and me, write well.